perhaps one of the most interesting data points to come out of all of the research that I was involved in at CEB and then Gartner and even afterwards was something we found right before my departure from Gartner. This is a 2021, roughly around in there. We were doing large-scale surveys of B2B buying behavior, so customers involved in large complex purchases, trying to understand just a range of different attributes of that buying behavior. But someone on the team, and I actually don't know who it was, had this really interesting idea to insert a question into the surveys, a hypothetical, and that was simply something along the lines of, if you could imagine buying this complex purchase without ever speaking to a sales professional at all, would you actually prefer to do it that way? We ultimately call this a rep-free experience. And what we found is the first year we ran that survey, about 43% of B2B buyers said, yeah, actually, I would absolutely prefer to buy this solution without ever talking to a sales professional. A year later, we ran the survey again with slightly different methodology, so it's not exactly apples to apples, but that number had climbed to roughly 75%. So what do you do in a world where your job is to sell complex solutions and 75% of B2B buyers tell us that they'd prefer to have a rep-free experience if it were possible? And I think one of the things that was most interesting about that survey is we traveled around the world, mostly virtually at that time, presenting that data to heads of sales, sales leaders, sales professionals. I think one of the things I found most interesting in those conversations and arguably debates was the strong reaction of dismissal. So a lot of leaders would look at that and say, 75%, I'm not sure if I buy that's awfully high. Every once in a while someone would say, I'm surprised it's so low. But one way or another, most heads of sales would say, yeah, but we're just not seeing this. Because in our company, it's impossible to buy our solution without talking to a sales rep. It requires customization. Our solution requires configuration. It's something that we have to co-create or co-design. So while it may be true in the abstract or in general, it doesn't apply to us because it's just impossible for 75% of B2B buyers to buy our solution without talking to a sales rep. And it was always at that point where I tried very diplomatically to make the counterpoint, which was simply to say, just to be very clear what this data is and is not. This is not a data point describing what customers are doing. It's a data point describing what customers would prefer to be doing if it were possible. And the fact that you are not seeing this in your organization, the fact that you're not seeing 75% of B2B buyers buying your solution without talking to a sales rep, but nonetheless our data say that 75% of them would prefer that, that actually raises this really interesting question. In fact, it raises a really concerning alarm to the degree that you have now a widening gulf between customer preference and customer reality, the way they'd prefer to buy versus the way that they are buying. Now, at Gartner back in the day, that research then went on to study this question of, all right, so what other ways could we engage with customers? We talked about digital and talked about integrating human and digital channels and some really great work that the team did back then. But the thing that's always stuck with me ever since then, and the thing that ultimately led to writing the Framemaking sale, was sort of a different question, which is, what would it take to be the one seller that customers actually do want to talk to? That's, I think, a more interesting question, at least for all of us in sales, and for that matter in marketing, which is there in fact a different way to show up? Is there a different way to engage with customers such that maybe they don't want to talk to most sales reps, but they do want to talk to you? And I think that's a really powerful question to ask, because I think we've actually found an answer. When we first put this data out, a lot of people asked, does this mean it's the end of sales as we know it, or the death of sales as we know it? A little over the top. That's frankly some serious hyperbole, isn't it? But nonetheless, here's an interesting question. Maybe it should be the death of sales as we know it, but maybe not the death of sales altogether. What if we could find a way to show up differently, to show up maybe a little less like a salesperson and a little bit more like maybe a human being? And I think that is really the fascinating thing to ask is, what would it look like for someone to say, I know I don't like talk to salespeople at all, but her, him, they're different. I'll talk to them. And how do I become that person? Food for thought.